I'm very, very excited for this conversation and for this evening for many reasons. Firstly, I'm a giant admirer of Kieran and everything that he does, and he has gone through a whole range of different jobs and incarnations and always lands up doing something both purposeful and interesting. So, and 100x for Impact is really a remarkable organization doing remarkable things. So to try and frame what we're going to try and do tonight, you've heard the kind of glass half empty account of the world, and it's very unconduity to give the glass half empty account, but it's a necessary setup to kind of talk about why 100x Impact is so important. So if you think of everything from economic inequality to the labor market eroding impact of AI, to great world conflict, to the nature of climate change, to the polarization of our politics, to the erosion of our democratic systems, you can keep going, and all of these things are bad in isolation, but they're kind of terrible when they run in a pack and they compound each other and accelerate each other. And that's a moment that we're in. And, you know, that we're nostalgic for the 90s and, the parts of the 90s that weren't awesome either. But, if you ask us, we'd take them back. And yet, we have some of the most remarkable technological advances that we've had ever in the history of our planet. And as evidenced by tonight, we have that married with unparalleled human endeavor and extraordinary entrepreneurship, and a real yearning to rise to the moment and to solve things. And so one of the things that 100x seeks to do, and we're going to, Karen and I, kind of dig into it a little bit, is how you take things that are isolated and idiosyncratic and once-off and get them to rise to the challenge of this moment and to allow them to expand and to scale. And so I guess the kind of framing of a kind of social unicorn is a kind of useful way to start our conversation. And what I'd love you to do is sort of set out what it is what's your raison d'etre? Why do you exist in the heart of the London School of Economics? And what are you seeking to do when you try to aspire to create a social unicorn? And then a little on, we're going to meet these aspiring social unicorns and some ecosystem funders who have wisely anticipated that this is a really smart thing to be doing, and we'll expand the conversation.
Brilliant.
Kieran.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you everybody for joining us on a cold Tuesday evening as well. Very grateful for you being here. I was kind of hoping that a fireside chat would actually have a fire.
Disappointing, but it's sustainability.
Sustainability. Okay. Well, we'll warm ourselves up with our sense of enthusiasm for this. So, social unicorns. What do we mean by social unicorn? We mean not companies worth $1 billion, but organisations whose impact could reach 1 billion lives. And specifically by that, we mean organisations whose models could reach 1 billion lives. It could be a single organisation, but actually everything that we know about how change happens is that it tends to happen through lots of organisations, through replication, through spread of models. So that's what we really focus on. And the reason that we focus on that is that I totally agree with you that the world doesn't lack for innovation. The world doesn't lack for brilliant social innovations even. But what we do have at the moment is this massive problem that very few innovations are scaling to reach the size of the problem that they were set up to address. And that's really where 100x was, that's our raison d'etre. That's why we were formed, was to understand that better than it's understood at the moment. Why? Well, in fact, we understand pretty well why it doesn't happen. What we understand less well is when it does happen, why did it happen? What does that look like? And so I can go into a little bit more detail about how we're set up as a 100x to learn about that question. But ultimately, we will just really want to observe something that's so rare that it means that very little is understood about how it could happen again, which is how innovations do reach the size of the problem that they were set up to address.
So let me come in on that. Is it that you're set up to be a learning institution in the heart of a great learning environment to understand why scaling doesn't happen and then in an agile way to learn and then to scale? Or are there some things that you already know why the rungs in the ladder are either broken or non-existent? Like, what is it that is not causing us to have $100 billion social enterprises or NGOs rising to these challenges? Why are they breaking down?
Or maybe not even $100 billion enterprises, just organizations that are impacting upon that many lives as well, because we're really agnostic actually about what form enables itself to reach that many people. So what we are at 100x is we're both a funding platform and a learning hub. So let me kind of go through both of those in turn. So what we're doing is we are working with amazing organizations from all around the world. So we're a few years old, we've already had 5,000 applications for the program. We've taken through 35 ventures to date, 97 of which are from emerging economies, 75% of which are led by female founders. And so what we're doing with the ventures that we're working alongside is focusing specifically on their impact endgame. Working with these, and we're working alongside ventures to look at the question of, well, how does your impact reach as far as possible? And that might be, yes, about scaling the venture, but it's also typically something about how does your model spread much further, and what's needed and what's necessary for that, which is a different approach than I think if you're looking typically at how do you scale a commercial business to reach as many people as possible, because it can take you into all sorts of places. It can take you into thinking about, well, there are really only three exits when you think about social innovation at scale. You can get governments to adopt something, you can get markets to adopt it, or you can talk about open source and replication. But what strategies bring you closer to those, and what can you do as a venture to address those? So we bring three different types of capital to the ventures that we partner with. One of those is financial capital, so we ourselves are a grant maker. We put unrestricted funding into the organisations that we partner with. And then Nalini will speak about the UBS follow-on funding that we have for some of the ventures who have repayable business models that can enable a different type of capital to come in. So that's the financial capital. More important than that, I think, is the intellectual capital. And this is where us being a joint venture with the London School of Economics really helps, which is, for example, working alongside the ventures that we partner with on looking at the questions that really matter to them, or connecting them to some of the best researchers in the world on that question. And then finally, we talk about social capital, which is how do we help connect the ventures to people who can really make a difference for them. And those might be key figures in governments, key figures in industry, and hopefully we'll have some examples of where that's happened. So that's us essentially being a funding platform with different types of capital. But then alongside that, we call ourselves a learning hub. And that is really where I think the distinct model of 100x comes in, which is to say, we want to learn from these ventures that we have the privilege of working alongside. They are all organisations that have already typically reached some serious scale. It might be millions, tens of millions of end users that they're reaching. And hopefully, as we work alongside them, that will become numbers even bigger than that, either directly or through how their models spread further. And we want to understand from those models, well, what's happened, why, what are the patterns of success, patterns of failure, what were the blockers, what were the enablers, but not so we can go out and just give even more advice to ventures about what they need to do differently, because there's plenty of that out there, with the real intent to go speak to funders, governments, investors, to say, well, look, you're all out there, you're all saying that you want to see more of this activity. What can you do to create the sort of system, the environment that makes it easier for not only these amazing ventures, but any venture like them, to go on and be successful? And we're learning we already know some of what we think some of the barriers are. Perhaps we can come on to those in a bit. But we've gone into this with a very open mind to be able to learn as we go. So each time and through each cohort, we're learning slightly more about the picture.
So give us a few. I mean, do you think we're going to? You could have this is a PhD thesis, and you're in a university, so you're going to have to distill it down. But, for example, are you finding that organizations that reach 1 billion end users are more effective if they do it themselves in one unified command and controlled way, that they scale they're responsible for their own destiny and they grow their own infrastructure and produce their own alliances? Or is it better to create 1,000 organizations in a swarm or a coalition, and you are attentive to growing the ecosystem? And you might say both, but are there things about those two binaries that you've learned, or are there other things which you can say, look, it's early days, but here are some things that we now are fairly confident on the evidentiary base that we have that allow for scaling?
Yeah, so areas where we're confident are we're definitely starting to see different types of models come through. 3 in particular. One that you might call a sort of direct delivery model, where you have ventures typically providing a service that's reaching lots of people. The second, which you might call a network model, where people are enabling communities to enable communities to enable communities. So sort of how does human capacity multiply? So a practical example there might be a venture we're supporting in India called People, who train teachers, and essentially that radiates further through communities. And then we see a lot of what we would call platform models, which essentially kind of think about an Airbnb or an Uber, an organization that essentially helps intermediate information or information asymmetries. And we'll see 2 platform models from ventures with us today. So we're seeing these kind of different models out there, and what we're learning is that some seem better geared up to different impact endgames. So some seem more attuned to a market picking them up, or potentially governments being able to procure or adopt versus others. One other thing that we've learned that I think could be particularly interesting for conversation is just how limited philanthropy is. So we ourselves are a philanthropic organisation. We work alongside a lot of investors. And I guess what we're learning at the serious scale end is there's almost like a conveyor belt that everybody assumes that you're going to put organisations and ventures and amazing impact models onto a conveyor belt, and you're going to work with them for a bit. You're going to help them on their journey, and then they're going along the conveyor belt, and somebody else will then work with them and engage with them, and they go on. And it turns out that actually the conveyor belt doesn't always kind of go onto a conveyor belt. Sometimes there's just massive holes in it. And so actually what we're doing in terms of a system, if you step back, we're setting up a lot of organisations to scale to a point where there's no further support or market to enable them to go further. And we've seen elements of that even in the applications to 100x. So we have in our portfolio previous winners of the Audacious Prize. For those unfamiliar with the Audacious Prize, it's probably one of the biggest philanthropic prizes on the planet. 10s, 20s, 30, 40 millions of philanthropic funding going into organisations.
Birth from TED, is that right? Audacious, birth from TED.
Yeah, birth from TED. And so I think the idea was finally get enough money into the serious ideas to enable them just to go on. And that's it, job done. Well, it turns out no. That actually philanthropy is a poor route to sustained service. But what it can do is it can put you in a position where, and we're here from 2 amazing ventures, where they can describe some of the things that philanthropy is doing that enables them to develop a model that a government can engage with, that a market can pick up as well. So it's getting much more sophisticated about what are these different types of capital, what roles can they play.
That's a super fascinating insight, right? I mean, it's an intuitive one that, corresponds with lots of people in the room's lived experience, but it foregrounds the need for philanthropy to be catalytic, to solve problems, to cure market failures, to incubate coalitions, to do a whole bunch of stuff. But it's basically saying, if you want to get to 1 billion people served, you probably at some point need to not rely fully and exclusively on philanthropy. And if that's the case, I guess the question is a philanthropist question, which is, how do you structure your giving such that you don't crimp an ability of the people who you're supporting in the early phases to be able to scale, lock them into forever NGO models, crimp their IP, stop them from making the transition from a non-profit to a for-profit. Some of those sort of things that everybody scratches their head at, producing wacky conflicts of interest at some stage. There must be a whole lab to be done just on that question.
Just describing a lot of that. And of course, we work globally as well. So in terms of our portfolio, it's about a third for-profit organisations, a third non-profit organisations, and a third that beautiful something in between. As well. But what's really interesting is you start to see as you look globally that what in one region will be perceived probably as a non-profit model, in another region will be a for-profit model as well. So there's a lot of the binaries I think that we've learned about how social change happens. Programs like 100x, and we're a community amongst others, are starting to question those. The advice, if there are philanthropists in the room, is that, and this might sound a little bit commercial to think about it this way, but if you're going through an MBA, somebody will start talking to you about exits. They will start saying the important thing to think about with any company that you're involved with is what's its exit, like who do you hand over to? But we tend not to think that way in the social change space. So we tend not, as philanthropists, and I've run a big philanthropy as well, we tend not to think about what is the end game? Where does this go to over longer term? And what type of capital do we need both to put in but also crowd in? And this does go beyond financial capital, and this is a little bit of a call out for me to those in the room, which is one thing that we really value in 100x and lots of organisations like us as well, is expert advice. So we have a community of multipliers. These are people that we connect 100x Ventures to, who I like to think can essentially just save an organisation doing 3 months of work when they have a half an hour or an hour conversation with somebody who's just been through that journey before, seen the pattern, knows what it looks like, and can give some advice. So if you think you're one of those people, particularly if you've been involved with some aspect of social change at scale or making a big change, do speak to me or any of the 100x team here tonight, because it's not just about the financial capital. The intellectual capital, the pattern recognition is such an important part of it too.
So I'm kind of itching to get these people up on stage, because we'll see examples of this. So I'm going to ask you a sort of final question, which is kind of your exit question, right? Which is 10 years down the line, you've outperformed all your most ambitious goals. What will have happened in the 10th anniversary of 100x Impact? And what do you sort of judge yourself against? What are you seeking to achieve?
There are almost no social unicorns at the moment. So it has to be easier. Like within 10 years, this has to be easier, because you set us up with all of the challenges that the world is facing, and those seem to be going in the wrong direction as well. And though whilst we are making progress, I think as an impact community, if we're being really frank about it, the problems are getting bigger quicker than we are. As well. So we need to make it easier. What we've seen is that with 100x, we are having an impact. We have seen that the ventures that we're working with have gone on to raise 15 times the amount of capital that we've put in, that in the short time that we've been around, that they've tripled their reach. So we're obvious that something good is happening. But in 10 years' time, we need to have many more social unicorns. We need to have billions of lives being impacted by the sorts of organisations that we partner with. We need to see trillions of pounds of capital coming in, and we can be part of that. That's what we're leaning into. And what will we have solved if we're part of there? I think we will have some clearer playbooks. If you are in government or you are a commercial actor actually, what can you really practically do to enable amazing ventures, who I know everybody's very keen to meet, to do more of what they do, more of what they can do brilliantly. And we'll have solved some part of this unnecessarily disorganized capital stack that sits around social innovation at the moment. By disorganized capital stack, I mean that if you were to map out the capital stack that sits around commercial innovation, it's not brilliant, but pretty much everybody can describe it. You start in your garage, you get your mum to give you some money, then you get an angel investor, get some VC, you go all the way through to IPO, and then you kind of get a yacht and destroy the planet. We all know what that looks like, and everybody knows what they do, and they know who's before them, they know who's after them in that capital stack. It is not the same around social innovation at all. In fact, it's like a game of snakes and ladders. Out there, you go up, you've got to go down, you go over, there's a cliff edge. So that is part of what we and others in our space are doing, is actually looking at some of the practical ways you solve that. So what would our exit be? That we've told a more positive story that this can happen. We've shown how it can happen. We've given people some of the tools to enable more of it to happen as well.
So it's at this moment that we're going to bring up the rest of the panel. And while we do a little bit of musical chairs, we're going to do the Conduit icebreaker. And so the goal here is for you to turn to somebody you don't know and you didn't come with, so that you get to meet people and create community, and answer the following question. We all know what scaling looks like in the private sector model. Kieran's just given a version of it. What about scaling for impact and impacting people's lives makes you feel queasy, and what makes you feel excited? And discuss. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, we don't, I mean, it's such a wonderful group. I don't mind if we go. Karen and I are going to be on the outside. I'd like you to be in the middle, and then be on either side. That's great. Now, I'm going to come to you first.
Okay. Should I introduce myself as well as the organization?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, it does circle a little bit.
Especially if you don't know the other person, there's so much difference.
Hello. Hello, 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 hello. Hello, hello, hello. Hello. Can you raise your hand if you can hear me? Can you raise your hand if you can hear me? Can you raise your hand if you can hear me? Can you encourage people around you to raise their hands if they can't hear me? Can you raise your hand? Good. Well, that didn't work at all. You had clearly nothing at all to say to each other. So I'm now going to call the panel back to order, and Asha has introduced them, so I'm not going to go through their compendious bios. I'm going to ask them, say who you are, tell us a little bit about the remarkable endeavor that you work for and have been instrumental in, and what your theory of change is. And I'm going to start with you now.
Thank you so much for having us and for fostering this amazing community. So I'm Nell, I'm the head of strategy at Chanson International, and my fun fact is that I was actually previously with 100X, so this is a nice full circle moment for me. And Chanson International is a fair finance platform. We support excluded youth in Africa, specifically in Rwanda, South Africa, Kenya, and Ghana, to access tertiary education that leads to employment and ultimately improves their livelihoods. And we do see ourselves as being more in the financial inclusion space than education, even though education is extremely important, because we really facilitate access to finances for people who are excluded from financial systems, which is actually the majority of African youth. So when I say excluded, what I mean is particularly youth from low-income backgrounds. So we help students who are primarily from households earning under $2 a day. We help especially rural populations, and we include in that slums and townships as well, where the access to education is extremely limited, and especially women who face higher structural barriers to both education and employment. So we focus on the most excluded, but really that represents the majority of African youth, because tertiary education enrollments there are, in the countries where we operate, are typically around 9%, compared to 38% globally. But we focus not just on education, we focus on income growth and livelihoods. So what we offer to these students as a value proposition is study worry-free. We will pay for your education up front. We will vet the education partner to ensure that they can lead you towards employment. And you will repay us only once you earn above a certain income. So once you're in employment and you're in a secure position to do so, and the repayment is based on your income. So it's not the interest, the principal plus interest, it's based on your income, a percentage of your income, which means you always repay based on your ability to repay and your security financially. And so to date, we've supported over 6,600 young people. Out of those, 93% successfully graduate, 71% gain employment, and out of those, they earn on average about 3 times the national median. So we can see the impact on livelihoods at the end of this line. And as we talk about end games, you might think 6,600 is nice, but it's not really the full, it doesn't serve the full demand, it's not transformative impact. And that is why the end game here is really important. We're not trying to be the biggest provider of ethical financing for youth. We're trying to be the best in class, and we're trying to prove the model that we're using, which is called an income share agreement, as an asset class locally in the countries where we operate. So we're really just building the evidence base so that ultimately we can get to the commercial adoption that you were talking about, so that local financial institutions can offer this product because they know that youth are investable and that it will lead to greater economic growth. So that's a little bit about us.
And I have one follow-up before I come to Rhea. How central to your model is a proof point that these loans are repayable and will be repaid?
It's extremely important because we raise financing for these young people through blended finance, and so we do have investors who expect a return, and for that to happen we need to prove the viability of the model, not just in terms of impact metrics, but the commercial viability. So whilst we can't offer market returns, like this is not a for-profit venture that will make you rich, we offer good returns to ensure that investors can recoup the investment. So for us, it's extremely important to manage the income share agreements, the contracts with the young people, in a way that ensures sustainability long term. And currently, our repayments are in good standing at 95%, which is actually above the general microfinance industry, and has been one of the key proof points to scaling our financing.
Amazing. Rhea, tell us about you.
Thank you, Paul, and thanks, Kieran, for setting us up really nicely. I'm Rhea. I'm the Director of Impact and Strategy at Visa, and I also founded Visa's India Impact business venture. And at Visa, we've been around for a decade, and what we essentially do is we're a digital mental health social enterprise with a very clear mission, which is to solve for the global mental health crisis. And the way we do that is by reaching people who have next to nothing in terms of access to high quality, affordable mental health care, And we primarily do it through digital means. So, of course, a decade ago, we started with a conversational AI chatbot, which was very novel in pre-generative AI days, now not so much anymore. And that was the primary way in which we were able to actually put high-quality, clinically validated mental health care in the phones of every single person who had, of course, access to the internet and was seeking help. And it's been 10 years, and we've now, of course, one of the largest and most validated mental health enterprises in the world, with about 7 million users across 95 countries. More than 1 billion conversations have been had on the WISA platform across the globe. And it's also the digital mental health enterprise with the largest body of evidence, more than 40 plus peer-reviewed, clinically validated studies, including randomized control trials with the likes of some of the best universities in the world. I'd say 2-3 things just in terms of scaling and endgame, what makes it special, why has it worked? One of the things behind scale was always this idea that we were obsessed with the idea that care needs to be effective. And you can spend years trying to design the best consumer app and the best technology or the AI models behind it. We started super scrappy, and it spread like wildfire. We've till date not spent a single cent on marketing. All the 7 million users have been entirely organic, and that's because the care is effective. And we've always known it, but now it's been validated as well. WISE has actually shown up to 40% reduction in depression, which is very clinically significant in users who use WISE versus those who don't. And the second magic sauce or recipe, why it scaled is we were surprised by how people immediately open up to something like a chatbot when the whole garb of stigma and judgment just falls down. And that is something really special in the model of delivery for mental health through a digital chatbot, which is, you of course need mental health professionals, and the supplies, everyone's aware of the problem and it's super limited. But the time that it takes for someone to open up to a digital chatbot is 4 times faster than it takes them to form the same therapeutic alliance bond with an actual human therapist professional. And so it's that speed to the bond, it's that ability to be 1/10 the marginal cost of delivery, and it's that ability to reduce judgment and be absolutely zero stigma is, I think, the key to what makes WISA scalable, and it's also what enabled us to therefore build on that model and now work with a lot of governments around the world and so on. So yeah, that's a little bit about what we do.
And a follow-up question from me, if I may. So what is like you described the chatbots being central to the magic and to the impact, but if you were to sort of distill it down to why those clinical peer-reviewed results are showing such remarkable drops, what is it, just in layman's terms, layperson's terms? Tell me what you do that's differentiated.
It's a great question. I feel like everyone's talking about social unicorns, but the real unicorn in mental health is trust. And the currency of trust is something that would be my one-word answer to what you said. And for us, what it means is when someone's having a panic attack at 4 a.m., which, I'd be surprised if there are people in this room who haven't had that experience. But, if you know someone who's gone through something like that, there isn't really anything out there that you can reach out to. You can be the most privileged speaking person in the most high-income country in the world, but at 4 a.m., even if you have a therapist, you probably can't reach out to them. And so what you can reach out to, and what people then do end up reaching out to, is something like WISA, which is 24/7, free of cost, and limitless. And one of the things we still do, and we've done this for the last 10 years, is we actually manually track our public reviews on the App Store, Play Store. You can go and see it yourself, but more than 500 people to date have very voluntarily written to WISA saying that this app is the reason that I'm alive, or this app has saved my life. And so it's 500, of course, in the scheme of, when we talk of billions, doesn't sound like much, but it's 500 real human beings who have themselves come to us and said, thank you for saving my life. And I think it's being seen and being trusted, and that's the currency of the real unicorn, that I'd say.
Amazing. So Nalini, UBS Optimus, you're a very senior person in the foundation, and you are backing this endeavor through a range of different strategies, providing follow-on financing and using both the capital but the network of UBS Optimists to leverage ways of supporting and helping scale. You have lots and lots and lots of opportunities to do this. So why 100x Impact? Why these sorts of people? What drew you to be supportive of this versus anything else that you could be doing?
Thanks, Paul. First of all, I just want to thank Paul, the Conduit Club, 100x, and our fantastic innovators here. It's a great privilege to actually be part of this panel, and the excitement, part of it, just listening to them just makes, they make us look very good. We are a bank, we are a corporate foundation, so it couldn't get any more boring than that. But actually, but that said, I think we are 25 years old. We are tied to the, I think, the largest wealth management bank, and one of the things that we have been doing quite well, we exist to help our clients invest their capital in a catalytic way. You used the word catalytic previously, but also towards impact. And, the first, I would say, around 10 years of the foundation, we were quite excited about, new research opportunities. We were deploying, project by project, right? So we're looking at impact at a project level, and quite proud of what we were achieving. So we supported some of the early violence sort of research, and that actually has taken on its own life. We support a lot in child protection, for example, supporting governments to scale some of the child protection interventions and so on. And you talked about the different opportunity, ways in which you can scale. So we sort of said, the grant, a lot of the capital was deployed through grants. But over the last 10 years, I think one of the things we got excited about is how can we go use it much more in a catalytic way, because we were also starting to see the opportunities for private sector to come in, because you had in the early 2000s, and post 2010 and so on, the Gates Foundation, the Children's Investment Fund founded, a lot of what we call as philanthrocapitalism, was coming into play. And we said, one of the things that the foundation itself was thinking, how can we sort of deploy our capital? And so we started this journey by, learning from others, actually. So Acumen Fund was doing quite a lot. So we started learning from them. We're saying, can we partner with them to learn? And we started investing in things, what we call as outcomes-based financing. So this is the education development impact bond with Educate Girls in India. So we started slowly dipping our toes into this sort of space, and where we started saying, can we invest our philanthropic capital in ways in which we can actually trigger a little bit more outcome-focused sort of development. But then as we started, investing, we started realizing that this is also a way to support social enterprises. It's because we started seeing that, a lot of our capital can also be deployed not just through grants, but also, we can use the whole range of our, what we call as toolkit, funding outcomes. But also, as we came across Shan Sen, and this was again, I think in 2021 or so, we said, can we actually support Shan Sen with a design grant, for example? Because we said that actually can be quite catalytic in actually maybe helping them develop their model, make the model investable. So from a design grant, we then went to what we call a simple agreement for future equity, a SAFE, where we said, okay, can we now actually invest in Shan Sen, converting, our agreement into future equity, and then we put in more equity. So we started that journey. But as you can see, by finding these enterprises, and you talked about it, Kiran, is so difficult. It's really, really hard, and our partnership with the 100x Accelerator is quite exciting for us, because they do a lot of the work in terms of actually helping us find these enterprises that we can then actually come in and then, it creates a pipeline for us for actually investing. So we use different instruments, like you were saying, sometimes we can follow on grants, follow-on outcomes-based instruments, follow-on impact-linked loans. So all of these are different ways in which we can use philanthropic capital in a very catalytic way. So that's that's our future, that's our thinking, and I would say a lot of it is funded entirely by our clients, and our operational costs are covered by the bank. So in a way, everything that our clients give goes directly into these enterprises and into these organizations.
That articulation can be summarized in one hyphenated word: a no-brainer. That seeing 100x and seeing these organizations was a very easy decision to be able to invest and facilitate. So Nell, I want to now ask you a scaling question which comes in two parts. The first is, you have a blended finance capital stack, the way that you scale. So in words of one syllable for a non-expert audience, just speak about that blended finance approach, because it's key to your scaling, I suspect. And then secondly, you're now raising £28 million. What has been hard about that, other than everything? Because I think that, give us the clues in, we want you to be able to have 500 million, not 28 million, and what can we learn about the 28 million that can take us to the 500 million?
Yes, so first I would say that blended finance is instrumental to our model, and everything we've learned, everything we've been able to achieve on that front is thanks to the UBS Optimus Foundation, who helped us set up our first facility, the Future Work Fund. And to understand blended finance in our context, you have to understand first the cost of our intervention, which is pretty high. So the cost of education in our markets is roughly $2,500. So that's really high, actually, when you think about scaling the supply to meet the problem. What we can see is that the return on investment in terms of impact is really worthwhile. So for every dollar invested, you unlock $61 in lifetime income for the young person, which represents $150,000 over a lifetime. So that's a huge transformative impact for their lives. But still, how do you scale that with philanthropy? The philanthropy is simply not sufficient to provide the financing to meet the size of the problem. So you have to look elsewhere for capital. And what we have as part of the income share agreement is a repayment mechanism. So it does generate a return over time. So you think, okay, now we can access investors who expect a return. But as a starting NGO, how do you convince investors to trust your model and to trust your long-term growth? You really need philanthropy in the beginning to de-risk the investment from those who have a higher risk appetites. So this is where blended finance is, I would say, magical, because you help bring in different layers of capital that have different risk profiles. And the philanthropists here are really critical and catalytic in helping unlock much larger pools of funding from development finance, for example. So we've been able, thanks to partners such as UBS Optimus Foundation, to unlock finance from DFC in the US, from SDG Outcomes Fund, and these come in greater tranches. And it's been really hard. And the hardest thing about that is track record. It's data, right? You can't just promise that the thing will work. So over time, what we see our role actually as being the actor that will build the evidence base to prove the model, so that ultimately institutional investors locally will feel ready to invest in income share agreements and ethical financing. But the way to do that is really through building data, not only in terms of impact, as we mentioned, but in terms of repayments, in terms of commercial viability. And each year it gets easier, and each year the chances of capital that we can track are getting larger, because we're proving that actually there is that viability. But for now, we have about 4 years of repayment data, even though we're 8 years old, because it does take time for the young people to go through education and get into employment. So really, this is a time game for us. We need 10 years of data. We need 25,000 students supported in order to prove at scale that the model works. So we're on the journey, and we're hopeful.
So when it comes to Ria, I'm going to ask you a similar question, but I want to flag something for you both to cogitate on. This description of philanthropic capital being necessary to create the evidence base to allow for-profit capital to come in. On one level, it feels like intuitive and obvious, and we should just be doing that. But on another level, I sort of have a question mark and an objection to it. And my question mark and objection is when somebody started up Facebook or a drug experiment, right? Nobody said that's very proven, that's a really easy thing to do. But a whole bunch of risk-taking private capital came in and burned through a lot of losses before profits arose. And the outcome of Facebook is like, well, you get to meet people more. These people's outcomes are really remarkable social changes. So one of the things that I'm sort of interested in is, wouldn't success be getting more private capital at an earlier stage to do what it should be doing, which is take risks and do so for really important social outcomes, because it takes risks all the time. So what is it that's causing it not to take this risk? I'm flagging that. Ria, I want to ask you a question about your model. So you're obviously trying to scale, and you have 7 million scale. So I have a question that comes in two parts. Is what's your business model for scaling, and where's private capital versus other forms of capital in it? And then two, I have to ask you the dreaded AI question. Which I think that kind of just asks itself really. But what guardrails are you going to put around your model to ensure that it does all the good things that AI does, but some of the more nefarious things that we've read about, much to our horror, don't happen?
I knew the AI question was coming. On the model, I think, Kieran, you were earlier talking about that nebulous space of like for-profit is a non-profit, and then the third is just somewhere in the middle. That's where Visa now operates. So we, of course, very quickly have started as a for-profit, venture-backed private capital equity startup 10 years ago. And about 3 to 4 years ago is also when we created a dual capital model. And so a dual checkbook model where we also now have philanthropic grant money, of course, including from the 100X back in 2024. The business model it's actually fairly simple, and then it's not simple. So the simple part is that there's a lot of markets in the world, and particularly high-income economies, where end users are willing to pay for mental health services. That's where we first began. Our markets were the US, UK, Singapore, Middle East, Australia. And then there's the rest of the world, or the global south, as we often like to call it, where the end users don't necessarily have paying capacity, and so the market is imperfect. What Visa benefited from was private capital actually taking that risk that you mentioned, Paul, because it's what built the engine. It's what allowed us to attract the right tech talent, built the world's leading AI models with the guardrails that I'll just speak about, along with the ability to actually be obsessed with user experience, iterate, spend years, take a product to market, scale it up, blah, 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 get B2B enterprises, run a whole commercial business engine that also, of course, then gave returns to the equity investors. So private capital was absolutely essential in kicking off and building the engine. But where it has a huge roadblock and where you exactly need models like 100X and what the UBS Foundation is doing is markets which have high need and low resources, private capital doesn't want to touch that. And so 4 years ago when we said, okay, how do we take this world-class AI with like XYZ awards and validated models to rural India? And we're an India-born startup, essentially. And so the founders, that's when we founded Visa Impact, which we internally like to call, which is taking that same model into the hands of people who can absolutely never afford to pay for it. And then what's the end game? And that's where our dual model became about, operating in the market in the high economies as a largely for-profit sort of thing that helps cross-subsidize, taking this intervention, localized and customized for the low-income economies, where philanthropic money has been absolutely instrumental. Even beginning to dream up that we could do something like that. It's something as simple as, building Visa in a language that was not English. Because everything we've done thus far, and I've spoken about, has been about Visa in English, but 3 years ago we built it in Hindi and then in Marathi, and more regional languages are upcoming. And that's been entirely because of philanthropic capital. So that's largely the business model. The AI question is, well, I think I'd frame it by saying, we're beyond the point where it's worth asking whether AI is good or bad for mental health. I think that's a redundant question. The question to ask is, how do you make AI safe for mental health? We're trying to be, the leading voice by banging on that trumpet for a while to say that you need clinical and privacy guardrails on anything generative AI that you do for mental health. The nice thing is that Pfiza's AI from day one has been rule-based. And when, of course, generative AI burst onto the scene, we try to incorporate generative AI models into our LLM. But everything the model or the chatbot will ever say to you is still clinically validated. And it'll always pass, the world's highest regulatory requirements. So, like HIPAA compliance, we have the FDA breakthrough designation in the US. The NHS has like 1 million complicated class device things which I wouldn't know about, but we meet all of those, and that's primarily because our AI models are deterministic. They can be traced back to where the source output's coming from, and that needs to be the gold standard. And so, big tech is currently, and it's in the news every day, but it started from denial by saying we're doing no harm, to now a place where they're very actively trying to shed liability by saying, okay, we're not meant to give medical advice and so on, but it's not stopping billions of users every day who turn to ChatGPT to talk about suicide. And so, timely question. We've got some of the answers, and the hope is that, there's greater recognition that AI for mental health is like the biggest opportunity I think this sector has seen, but it needs to absolutely be done in a safe way.
I'll come on to your brilliant question about private capital, but just to point out something that's really obvious there, we've kind of got two examples here of organizations of just showing what better looks like, the demonstration of what better practice is, and that is absolutely critical. I've spent a career working more like the system side, like the big philanthropy or the government side of this, and I just couldn't emphasize enough how important it is to see the models of what better looks like when it's really placed communities and individuals at its heart. It's been done in the right way, it's been done with the right values behind it. But to your question, yeah, I actually think we oversimplify what philanthropy is, because we say that philanthropy is risk-taking and kind of funds innovation, and only philanthropy does that, but that's not true. That's what capital does, and philanthropy is just private capital as well. So we make it out like it's something different. It's the mandate often that sits behind it. What can you do with that private capital? And a lot of commercial capital has other things that it can focus on, and chooses to focus on those. There are pools of commercial capital that feel like they've got no alternative now to start focusing on things that have a greater social or environmental impact. See some of the amazing work that Conduit's done with insurers around flooding, for example, or big pension funds. They're starting to see it. But that's a long way away from where some of this innovation really happens. So yes, we should be asking more of private capital. We'd be naive to expect private capital to be doing much more than it is at the moment. It's not to say that it shouldn't be. But philanthropy can play that sort of bridging role importantly. And just to kind of point out the obvious when you know it, but not so obvious when you don't know it, is just the scale of the sums that we're describing here. For every £1 of philanthropy globally, there's about £10 of government spending, there's about £100 of private wealth out there. So these are all factorial. So it's actually, what we see in these models is actually amazing organizations got brilliant at thinking about how do they pull those together. And whilst we're talking about private capital, I wouldn't move away from talking about the importance of government procurement as well, because a lot of this is about the invested capital, but ultimately it's about a market you sell into. And for a lot of the ventures that we work with, ultimately the end game is some form of government buying it in a sustained way at scale.
Eleni.
Yeah, I mean, a few points there. So one is, I think, when we talk about philanthropy, you're absolutely right, Kieran. Like, we have a whole spectrum of philanthropists, you see. So some of them very comfortable, in the early stage enterprises. And so I think, but then when you look at, some of those valleys of death and so on, some very uncomfortable funding, because they'd rather be much more still in the charitable end of things, as opposed to be seen as making money out of social and environmental causes. So there is so we do face some philanthropists who really face that question, should I be making money? This is not about financial returns, it's really about impact. Whereas we do have some philanthropists who are interested in the later stage, but they want to support the early stage, but then they come in with much more commercial capital in the later stages. So for us, we need to map actually within a given sector, an issue, what kind of capital is really important for solving different, barriers, and which kind of philanthropist then we go to. So we even actually have our own sort of way of how do we actually talk about this issue with different kinds of philanthropists. The second, I think I wanted to also just say is, I think, what you were saying, why should we force, I think your question, the social enterprises to, a higher degree of standard than, say, some of the private, Facebooks and so on. That's a good one. That's an interesting question. And I think we have sort of grappled with it ourselves and trying to be a little bit more practical about what exactly, what impact means and for whom, you see. And I think where we are trying to move away from, Paul, is you're not satisfying us, but obviously who benefits and is it beneficial to them, and can we actually demonstrate that? To your point, the trust point becomes really important in this case, because the longevity of any enterprise or an intervention is not just about capital, it's also about actually will the beneficiaries or will those customers, actually continue to use this product or this service in the long term. So for us, we also have to think about that. So we've, from an optimist perspective, we've taken a much more practical approach of actually asking the right questions and making sure the degree of verifiability and so on is actually practical and fit for purpose. But I know there are other experts here who have a different methodology and much more would welcome, other opinions as well when it comes to.
Well, that's a perfect. I've hogged your expertise for too long, so we're going to turn to this audience and ask. You can ask questions of the panel. I'm going to plead that you ask a question and not make a speech, and therefore I'm going to turn to, and you're going to take my mic, which loses my ability to referee the speech makers, but here we go.
Sorry, the trouble is I want to make a bit of a speech, if you'll permit me. First of all, I'd say it's scaling impact, not scaling organizations, which is important. I'd like to just give 2 or 3 case studies. The first is the world's biggest literacy program, which is called Turn on the Subtitles. Turn on the Subtitles is a very simple idea that on all children's programming, same language subtitling is turned on default position. And the currency they're using to create this is A-list celebrities and a little bit of investment capital. The second is something I was involved in. It is Childline India Foundation. I was at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. I met a lady called Jeru Bilamoria. I loved her idea. It was a tiny project in Mumbai, and I came back to the UK, got funding from the lottery to scale it up. We promised to scale up from 1 city to 7 cities in 3 years. We were actually in 48 cities by the end of 3 years. The last line of my budget was international conference, where we launched Child Helpline International. There are now Childline centres in 1,000 cities in India and a worldwide network. And the capital we used was lottery capital to get it going, plus Government of India partnership, plus Tata consultancy services to design the platform to make it happen. And I'd just like to say, bigness is often the enemy of creativity, and the idea of creating something which will reach 1 billion people horrifies me. I like 1,000 flowers to bloom, and I'd like to create a platform called 1,000x rather than 100x.
Everybody, there's only one Michael Lawson in the world, so everybody else has to ask a question.
Hello, my name is Grace. I guess the question could go to anyone on the panel. I wanted to ask about catalytic or attribution, contribution, however you want to frame the idea of what is additionality for funders or donors. I find that it often takes the wind out of the sails when talking about actual impact or outcomes, because everyone wants to be that bit of money that actually, you know, made gender equal or actually solved climate change. So I'm curious about how 100X thinks about it. And then maybe from the grantee or investee side, do you feel that that gets in the way of actually making impact?
It's a brilliant question. Look, we at 100X, I hope we're adding value to the ventures that we work with, but we're a bit part in their extraordinary stories. So if we're adding value, fantastic. We do have the privilege of learning from them as well. So I agree with you. Everything that we know about social change is that it's a team sport. And so we kid ourselves if we push ourselves too hard. Now, of course, we need to know if what we're doing is useful. We want to see that the organisations themselves find what we do valuable, and hopefully they do. But yeah, I couldn't agree more with the spirit of the question, which I think is that kind of over-seeking to be kind of the attributor, the contributor, gets in the way. And for us, it's not part of our model. It's I hope it feels like it's a partnership that we get to learn alongside. I'll also say that at 100X, we absolutely stand on the shoulders, not just of the ventures that we work with, but huge numbers of other ecosystem partners as well. Pretty much every one of the ventures that comes through to us has worked with a whole set of other philanthropies, mentors, advisors. They've been through prizes as well. So we kind of need to get out of like the individual organisation here. It's actually how we as a system are creating a system that increases the likelihood that any of these organisations go on to have the impact of which they're pretty capable.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. In our case, we've been really privileged to partner with the right funders who have been they've personalized their support to us, and 100X is definitely one of those where it doesn't feel like a one-size-fits-all type of support with a lot of, we are the additionality, and now, you know, you need to pronounce it as such. It's been really a partnership, and I think we like to say we select our funders well, but I mean, when you need funding, you do end up. So I think we've been extremely lucky. And in terms of the reporting that's asked of us, you know, the additionality there, for us it's been really simple because we're an outcomes-based model, so we have to track all of this data regardless for our own health. So it's been really simple to communicate this back to our funders and really simple for them to see what is our own additionality, and then their additionality has been holistic. It's not just funding, it's been the network that's been opened up, it's been the ideas. So I think we've been very privileged. It's a short answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's really important. As you'd imagine, there are all sorts of funders in the world, folks who try and do it right, and you know, there's still traditional philanthropy, I would say, where at least in the mental health realm of things, there's a real replication crisis, which is that, you know, often philanthropists, particularly those newer to philanthropy, everyone wants to do the new shiny novel thing. Mental health has been solved. Like, we know what works. You don't need to fund the new shiny novel thing. And so I think my appeal to philanthropists, if there are any in the room, would be to actually lean into the replication. If you know what works, actually take it to contexts and settings and resources where it doesn't work, as opposed to, you know, looking for the next big shiny thing.
Thanks. I found this question around the sort of end of the capital stack, for instance, the audacious price, a daunting thought that would lead organizations to return back to someone like 100X, for instance, having gone through the ladder. So I was wondering about what the alternatives beyond that is, and thinking specifically about pension funds and sovereign wealth funds. how far away are we from, say, UBS Optimus Foundation's perspective of getting those sort of money movers involved in this space? Is that near future? I know Temasek, for instance, are dabbling in the space, and are we seeing similar developments in Europe and globally generally?
This feels like a UBS sort of question, since you're proximate to those pools of that kind of
Yeah. So we are talking. I mean, I think one of the things we do face is, working, within even Optimus Foundation, working within a bank. Some of the funds that we raise, like for example, the $100 million SDG Outcomes Fund with the Bridges Outcomes Partnership, they all seem actually relatively small compared to the size of all of the other deals within the bank, So I think one of the big challenges is how do we get some of them to, the size, the pipeline. We need to build a pipeline. We need to also then get some of the topics that actually have those kinds of investment-ready sort of enterprises and organizations. So we are actually in the middle of thinking through different structures, like using fixed income, for example, and mix the fixed income with impact investing, for example. So there are different ways in which we're trying to see how we can bring in bigger pools of capital to make it much more attractive. But it's not easy. It's quite difficult, both in terms of getting that kind of capital, but more importantly, getting that pipeline and getting some of that data ready to show that kind of investment readiness.
Big pools of capital are really, really important. So take that for granted. But actually, with a lot of the ventures that we're working with in 100X, actually, I wouldn't say that like the biggest pool of capital is actually going to be the solution. Because a lot of them are doing things. I'll give you two really practical examples. Are doing things that is cleverly plugging in to where money is currently being spent in a system, and enabling much more value to be created out of it. So one of those is called IntelliHealth. They're based in India. One of those is called ImpulsoGov, and they're based in Brazil. They both work around health in different ways. So IntelliHealth focus on access to healthcare, particularly in rural India, particularly for women. And ImpulsoGov in Brazil are looking at how you help community nurses essentially be much more effective in knowing who to go see next. Now, both of these models are using a sort of kind of a tech underlay to plug into where governments are currently spending a lot of money to make it easier for people to get access to better quality health. In telehealth's case, that is basically by putting telemedicine into the healthcare system, particularly between community health facilities and big city health facilities, to increase the quality of care for people who have to go to those community health facilities. Now, those are now reaching millions and millions of people, but governments have spent a big amount of money there. And so, yes, really big pools of capital do matter, but often what I think we're describing here is like clever amounts of capital going in at the right time to the right organizations can be pretty transformative in giving the demonstrators that and then enable those who our agenda setters, governments, for example, to think, well, we could just buy differently. We could do this. We could scale it up. And it might be those ventures or it might be others like them.
I was just want to say, the only thing I would challenge there is I think you do need, but I think this is where I think what you're also trying and where we struggle, Kiran, is also what is our role, right? So sometimes I think, there is a role that the foundation plays within the bank and within the ecosystem where we can actually plug in and we can bring those up to a certain point. But beyond that, you do need, I think, bigger pools of capital in some cases. But actually finding out what our role is something that we are trying to figure out and where we can be much more catalytic.
I think I'm being told that we have to begin to wrap. So I'm going to try and ask, is there a question in the back, Asher, or? No? Okay. So I'd like the two of you who are the scalers to leave us with a insight or an aha on your scaling journey, like what you have thought, where you think what you've learned about scaling that you didn't know beforehand, what you'd like to impart about scaling to people in the room who are trying to grow, and we'll give them an insight that they'll walk away and think about this on. So that, and then I want to ask Kieran and Nalini a question, which is, we've danced around money for a lot of the evening, and we sort of started by saying, well, philanthropy can do so much because it's 1, then 10 is government, and 100 is private, and what we've got to try and do is grow ourselves up towards more money used in a smarter way. But is there also a way in which it's not always about money? It's about cooperative models or new forms of voluntarism or changes in culture. You know, like violence against women is not really just about money. It's also about men changing the way they think, or stopping genocide is not just about money. It's about people saving people and thinking about responsibility to protect. And when we think about scaling impact, are there ways that we ought to be careful not to be trapped only in a money paradigm? And money is important, don't get me wrong, but it's money plus, surely, or even it's this plus money, and this is the first thing. So maybe you two can give that, but over to you.
Great. So I think one of our aha moments in terms of scaling has been that the key for us is not our current solution, right? It's not just income share agreements, but it's aligning incentives in the market, because we're trying to do systems change at market level and we're looking towards commercial adoption. What we've really had to figure out is the incentive for each player in that ecosystem, and to tailor the model to fit that, because if you're missing one of them, then the rest might be beautiful and work perfectly, but you'll never get to scale. So we've had to change our focus multiple times, and we still are adapting to ensure that it fits the system. It doesn't just fit the user or the immediate funder.
Maybe two things. One is that we've realized that scale is not magic. Scale is a series of very boring decisions that need to be made consistently and consistently well, which is things like, you know, data compliance, data security, user privacy, clinical safety. These are all unglamorous, boring things, but absolutely essential to do those consistently and early on to be able to scale. And then, you know, you can pepper in magic sauce of what you're doing. And the second thing on scaling, or the aha moment for us, was the whole government adoption thing. Of course, you know, I didn't speak too much about it, but a large part of our work now in India is to really think about how does the government come in, where do they come in order to take the solution to people who don't have end user paying capacity. And to work with the government, you need to speak the government's language. And so, you know, a digital mental health app with a conversational AI chatbot isn't necessarily a budget line in India's mental health budget. And so we've really reworded and rewrapped everything we've done. So, you know, you sell it or pitch it as a life skills and resilience intervention for adolescent girls that helps them, you know, navigate conflict and opportunities. And at the heart of it, it's still the same thing. But I think that was the aha moment for us, is to be flexible and to really think of different lenses in which the same impact, because, and sir, I really like what you said about it's not about the organization, it's about the impact. And if the impact is going to reach that adolescent girl in rural India, it doesn't matter if it's an education intervention or it's a health intervention or even a life skilling intervention, right? It's who's willing to pay money for what. And so if it fits the bill, then you use that to scale.
So, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I think it's certainly not about money. For, you know, I think we call ourselves, I think a lot of the work that we support is what we say is impact first. So for us, it's really impact. In fact, a lot of the financial returns is anywhere between, it's single digits, sometimes it's 3%. It's really, but it's what we track is if there's no impact, we wouldn't fund it. An example for us, and so that's the impact, you know, for us, for example, we have now, and I mentioned a portfolio on child protection that we were we had been investing in for quite some time. We brought together a cohort of about 10 clients, completely underfunded topic, which is where I think, where the returns were entirely in terms of actually children who would have prevented from, be preventing these kids from going into orphanages in South Africa, in India, in Kenya, and actually we create now a global movement, where we now have a portfolio of about 16 partners. And again, the scaling is very much through governments. And this is not something that you can actually price in a financial way, but the returns is really, in terms of the social impact that we are having, for the children and families. But another level of impact for us as a foundation that is entirely dependent on client funding, we also look at the impact we're having on the client, in the client's giving, their own, are they giving more strategically to things that actually have an impact and from a systems perspective? So are they thinking longer term? And actually I would say that's where for us is also, again, you can't translate that into capital necessarily, but the mindset change is tremendous. And we've got a number of our philanthropists now on that journey with us, investing in systems and asking these kinds of questions and investing their risk capital in many of these enterprises without actually looking at financial returns in the first place.
We started off by saying that the world doesn't lack for innovations, but we do lack for innovations reaching the scale of the problem that they're set up to address. The world doesn't lack for money either. There's plenty of it out there, but we're not allocating it as a planet in the spaces that we need to. I think the line that is probably most important for what we're about as 100X is one that you, Michael, said, and really, that you said it's not about the organisations, it's about the impact that spreads from them. But the organisations do matter, and so, I mean, two amazing ones here. If you are in a position to be able to partner, support organisations like WISA, like Chancellor International, or others, please do. If you know of organisations like them that you think we should know about at 100X, please put them towards us. If you would like to know about the sorts of organisations we back because you want to back similar ones, also do please be in touch. But I would say that capital matters. We just need to be broader about what we think of as capital. And so yes, financial capital, but the intellectual capital, that's why we're a joint venture with the LSE. And ultimately the social capital, which I guess is why we all come out on a cold Tuesday evening, because we all probably believe in this idea that if we do focus together on these challenges with inspiring founders and teams that have identified a clever way of addressing things that practically the world's not been very good at addressing, we can make serious progress. And what attracted me to 100X was actually just where you started off, Paul. You were listing off the world's great challenges. And I actually do think we can make serious dents into them, but we've got to think quite differently about how we go about making those dents for that to become true.
So, I mean, extraordinarily gifted founders, really thoughtful, sophisticated philanthropists who are thinking not in their own terms about ecosystems. And, we set the Conduit up to be about supporting ecosystems and allowing the connections that will be made tonight and many other nights to happen. So I'm absolutely thrilled, and I was delighted to be able to play a small role in comparing this. I want to leave with one little thought about your AI comment, because it struck me that we have done an absolutely appalling task right now as humanity in getting on top of AI. And for you to sort of in a throwaway way go, what we do as a venture that has a billionth of the resources of what the big AI company has, but you regulate, you police, you take efforts to follow the evidence, you have clinical supervision, and you do all these self-imposed things in order to have integrity. And you do so voluntarily, not because anybody told you you must do it, but because it's what you should do as a responsible citizen. And for AI companies to have to be persuaded and not to do what you do voluntarily is, I think, both an illustration of the integrity of what you're doing and the enormous unsolved problem that's sitting out there that's going to zap us on many, many, many different fronts. And so one of the strange things in which you may scale and impact 1 billion people is of AI companies which copy what you did. And we should be doing more of that as well. And I think that's also one of the things about why it's important to show up on a cold night, is because you get incidental insights in addition to the ones that you expect that can be just as powerful. And for that, I'm incredibly grateful to all of you and incredibly grateful for all of you who came. So thank you.